In the summer of 1975, a routine passenger ferry carrying 4.1 million in insured cargo exploded in the middle of Lake Superior, taking with it 23 lives and one of the most valuable shipments ever transported across the Great Lakes. The official investigation concluded that faulty wiring in the engine compartment had triggered a catastrophic fuel ignition. The case was closed, the insurance claims were paid, and the wreckage was left to rest on the lake floor, 180 feet beneath the surface. What no one suspected was that the explosion had been anything but accidental. For nearly 5 decades, the truth remained buried under tons of twisted metal and silt. But in the spring of 2023, a team of technical divers exploring the wreck for a documentary project made a discovery that would shatter everything the authorities thought they knew about that tragic day. Hidden beneath a section of collapsed hull plating, they found a waterproof storage locker that had somehow survived the blast intact. Inside was a collection of documents, photographs, and personal effects that painted a very different picture of what had happened aboard the MV Northern Star on July 18, 1975. The ferry had been operating the Duluth to Thunder Bay route for over a decade, carrying passengers, vehicles, and commercial freight across the international waters of Lake Superior. On that particular morning, it departed Minnesota with 127 passengers and crew, along with several cargo containers bound for Canadian customs processing. Among those containers was a specially secured shipment of rare earth minerals, industrial diamonds, and refined precious metals valued at just over $4 million. The cargo belonged to Midwest Mining Consortium, a company that had been quietly moving high-value materials across the border for years without incident. Captain Robert Hayes had been running ferries on the Great Lakes for 23 years. His crew knew the route by heart, and the Northern Star had an impeccable safety record. Weather conditions that morning were ideal, with calm seas and clear visibility. Everything about the crossing appeared routine until 11:47 a.m., when witnesses on nearby vessels reported seeing a massive explosion tear through the ferry's midsection. The blast was so powerful that it could be heard from shore, nearly 8 miles away. Within minutes, the Northern Star was listing heavily to starboard, taking on water faster than the pumps could handle. Coast Guard vessels and private boats rushed to the scene, managing to rescue 104 survivors from the frigid waters. 23 people, including Captain Hayes, were never found. The subsequent investigation was thorough by the standards of the time. Federal maritime inspectors examined the wreckage that had washed ashore, interviewed survivors, and analyzed the ferry's maintenance records. The conclusion seemed straightforward enough. A section of electrical wiring in the engine compartment had deteriorated over time, eventually sparking a fire that ignited fuel vapors. The explosion that followed had been swift and devastating, leaving little time for evacuation procedures. Insurance companies processed claims totaling nearly $6 million, covering both the lost vessel and its cargo. Families of the deceased received settlements, and new safety regulations were implemented for passenger ferries operating in the Great Lakes region. The case was officially closed in early 1976, filed away in federal archives where it would remain untouched for decades. What made the Northern Star incident particularly tragic was how preventable it seemed. The ferry had been scheduled for a major electrical overhaul just 2 months after the explosion. Had that work been completed earlier, investigators believed, the faulty wiring would have been discovered and replaced. It was a stark reminder of how routine maintenance deferrals could have catastrophic consequences, but there were details that never quite fit the official narrative. Several survivors reported hearing what sounded like multiple explosions in rapid succession, not the single blast described in the final report. Others mentioned seeing unfamiliar crew members on board that morning, men who didn't seem to know their way around the vessel. These accounts were noted in initial interviews but were later dismissed as confusion caused by trauma and the chaos of the emergency. The cargo manifest also raised questions that were never fully addressed. While the precious metals shipment was well documented, there were discrepancies in the paperwork that suggested additional items might have been loaded without proper customs declarations. A dock worker in Duluth claimed he had seen unmarked crates being loaded into the ferry's secure storage area early that morning, but his statement was not included in the final investigation file. Most puzzling of all was the behavior of the Midwest Mining Consortium in the aftermath of the disaster. Rather than pursuing insurance claims for their lost cargo, the company quietly dissolved within 6 months of the explosion. Its assets were distributed among shell corporations, and its key executives disappeared from public records. For a business that had just suffered a $4 million loss, this response seemed oddly muted. The wreck of the Northern Star settled on a relatively flat section of the lake bottom, its broken hull creating an artificial reef that attracted fish and curious divers over the years. The depth and cold water temperatures meant that only experienced technical divers could safely explore the site, and most who did were primarily interested in the historical significance rather than any potential discoveries. That changed in 2023 when marine archaeologist Dr. Sarah Chen received funding for a comprehensive survey of Great Lakes shipwrecks. Her team planned to use advanced underwater imaging technology to create detailed 3D models of historically significant vessels, including the Northern Star. The project was intended to preserve these sites digitally before further deterioration made documentation impossible. Chen's team included some of the most skilled technical divers in the region, men and women who had explored dozens of deep wrecks across the Great Lakes. They were accustomed to working in challenging conditions, navigating through twisted metal and debris fields while managing complex life support systems. What they weren't prepared for was finding evidence that the Northern Star's destruction might not have been the accident everyone believed it to be. The dive team spent 3 days conducting their initial survey, methodically photographing and measuring different sections of the wreck. The ferry had broken into several large pieces when it hit the bottom, with the bow section relatively intact and the stern heavily damaged. The midsection, where the explosion had occurred, was a jumbled mass of twisted steel and scattered debris. It was during their exploration of this debris field that diver Marcus Webb noticed something unusual. Partially buried beneath a section of collapsed decking was what appeared to be a rectangular metal container, roughly the size of a small suitcase. The object was wedged tight against a structural beam, which had apparently protected it from being scattered with the rest of the wreckage. Webb initially assumed it was part of the ferry's equipment, perhaps a toolbox or emergency supplies container. But as he cleared away the sediment and debris, he could see that it was actually a waterproof storage locker, the kind used for protecting sensitive documents or valuable items in marine environments. More intriguingly, it appeared to have been deliberately secured to the hull structure, not simply stored in a cargo area. The discovery protocols for the project required that any significant finds be photographed in place before removal. Webb documented the locker's position and condition, noting that its seals appeared intact despite nearly 5 decades underwater. The locking mechanism was corroded but still functional, suggesting that whatever was inside had been protected from the lake water. When the team finally brought the locker to the surface, they faced a dilemma. Opening it immediately might damage any contents, but waiting could mean losing valuable evidence if the seals failed. Dr. Chen made the decision to transport the container to a specialized conservation laboratory where it could be opened under controlled conditions. The laboratory analysis revealed that the locker had indeed maintained its watertight seal. Inside, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic sheeting, were dozens of documents, photographs, and personal items that had been perfectly preserved by the cold, oxygen-free environment. The contents of that locker would fundamentally alter everything investigators thought they knew about the Northern Star disaster. Among the preserved documents were handwritten notes, shipping manifests with falsified entries, and a series of photographs that had never been submitted to the original investigation. But the most damning evidence was a detailed floor plan of the ferry, marked with precise notations indicating the locations of explosive charges. The handwriting on these documents belonged to Thomas Mitchell, a former demolitions expert who had worked construction jobs around the Great Lakes region in the early 1970s. Mitchell's name had never appeared in any official records related to the Northern Star, yet here was clear evidence that he had not only been aboard the ferry but had been actively planning its destruction. Dr. Chen's team immediately contacted federal authorities, but the jurisdictional questions were complex. The explosion had occurred in international waters, the ferry was registered in Canada, and the cargo had originated in the United States. After several weeks of bureaucratic negotiations, the case was assigned to a joint task force comprising investigators from both countries. Detective Lieutenant James Crawford had spent most of his career working maritime crimes for the Ontario Provincial Police. He had seen his share of insurance fraud cases, smuggling operations, and accidental disasters, but the Northern Star evidence presented something entirely different. The level of planning revealed in Mitchell's notes suggested a sophisticated operation with multiple participants and substantial financial backing. The photographs found in the locker were particularly revealing. They showed Mitchell and at least 3 other men aboard the ferry during what appeared to be a reconnaissance visit weeks before the explosion. The images captured details of the engine room layout, cargo storage areas, and passenger evacuation routes. One photograph showed Mitchell examining the exact section of wiring that investigators had later blamed for the electrical fire. But the most significant discovery was a carbon copy of a contract, partially degraded but still legible. The document outlined payment terms for what was euphemistically described as cargo retrieval services. The client was identified only by a code name, but the payment amount was substantial enough to suggest that someone had been willing to pay handsomely for the Northern Star's destruction. Crawford began working backward from the contract details, using forensic accounting techniques to trace financial records from 1975. The task was complicated by the age of the documents and the fact that many of the banks and businesses involved had long since ceased operations. However, patient detective work eventually revealed a pattern of cash transfers that originated from an account controlled by Henrik Volkov, a businessman with ties to several Great Lakes shipping companies. Volkov had maintained a low profile throughout his career, operating through a network of subsidiaries and front companies that made his activities difficult to track. Public records showed that he had interests in mining operations, freight forwarding, and maritime salvage, but the full extent of his business empire remained unclear. What was clear was that he had the resources and connections necessary to orchestrate a complex insurance fraud scheme. The motive became apparent when investigators examined the cargo manifest more closely. While the official record showed precious metals and industrial materials worth $4 million, Mitchell's notes suggested that the actual shipment was far more valuable. References to special containers and priority items indicated that the Northern Star had been carrying something worth significantly more than what appeared in the customs documentation. Further research revealed that Volkov's companies had been experiencing financial difficulties in the months leading up to the Northern Star explosion. Several major contracts had fallen through, and at least 2 of his subsidiaries were facing bankruptcy proceedings. The insurance payout from the ferry disaster would have provided exactly the kind of capital injection needed to stabilize his operations. The plan, as reconstructed from Mitchell's notes and subsequent investigation, was elegantly simple. Mitchell and his team would board the ferry as passengers, carrying concealed explosive devices designed to simulate an electrical fire. The charges would be placed strategically to ensure maximum damage while creating a plausible accident scenario. the valuable cargo would be written off as lost, allowing Volkov to collect the full insurance payout while secretly recovering the materials from the wreck at a later date. What they hadn't anticipated was the violence of the explosion. Mitchell's calculations had apparently underestimated the ferry's fuel capacity, resulting in a blast far more powerful than intended. Instead of a controlled sinking that would leave the cargo accessible for later retrieval, the Northern Star had been torn apart, scattering its contents across the lake bottom and making recovery impossible. The human cost of this miscalculation was devastating. The 23 people who died in the explosion had been sacrificed for a scheme that ultimately failed to achieve its primary objective. Mitchell himself was among the victims, killed by the very explosion he had engineered. Crawford's investigation team spent months tracking down surviving associates of both Mitchell and Volkov. Most had died in the intervening decades, but a few were still alive and willing to talk. Their testimonies painted a picture of a criminal organization that had operated with impunity across the Great Lakes region for years, using maritime disasters and accidents as cover for insurance fraud and cargo theft. The breakthrough came when investigators located Elena Vasquez, a former bookkeeper who had worked for one of Volkov's shell companies in the mid-1970s. She had kept meticulous records of financial transactions, including payments to Mitchell and his team for what she had been told were legitimate salvage operations. Her files contained bank routing numbers, payment schedules, and communication logs that provided the missing links in the conspiracy. Vasquez revealed that the Northern Star job had been just one of several similar operations planned by Volkov's organization. Ships had been deliberately damaged or sunk across multiple jurisdictions, always in ways that appeared accidental and always with valuable cargo that could be written off for insurance purposes. The Northern Star had been chosen specifically because of its international route, which complicated investigations and made it easier to manipulate customs records. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Over a period of nearly 5 years, Volkov's organization had been responsible for at least 7 maritime incidents, resulting in millions of dollars in fraudulent insurance claims and an unknown number of deaths. The Northern Star explosion had been their most ambitious operation, but also their last. The unexpected violence of the blast had attracted too much attention and made future operations too risky. Armed with this evidence, authorities began the process of reopening not just the Northern Star case, but several other maritime disasters from the same period. The legal challenges were immense, given the age of the crimes and the international jurisdictions involved, but the documentary evidence was compelling enough to warrant formal proceedings. The investigation into Henrik Volkov himself proved more challenging than expected. By 2023, the man was 87 years old and living in a private care facility outside Toronto under an assumed name. Age and declining health had rendered him largely incoherent, but his medical records revealed a pattern of controlled dementia that seemed suspiciously convenient. When lucid, he claimed no memory of the Northern Star or any maritime business dealings from the 1970s. Detective Crawford wasn't convinced. He had seen enough white-collar criminals over the years to recognize the signs of someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of selective amnesia. Volkov's financial records told a different story than his claimed ignorance. Even in his supposed mental decline, complex trust funds and offshore accounts continued to generate substantial income, all managed by lawyers who cited attorney-client privilege when questioned about their elderly clients' affairs. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Among Mitchell's preserved documents was a small address book, its pages filled with coded entries that had initially seemed meaningless. A forensic linguist working with the task force recognized the notation system as a variant of shorthand, commonly used by demolitions experts to record technical specifications. When decoded, the entries revealed not just contact information, but detailed records of previous jobs, payment amounts, and operational notes. One entry stood out immediately. Listed under the codename Lighthouse was a series of dates, locations, and monetary figures that corresponded exactly with maritime incidents across the Great Lakes between 1971 and 1975. The pattern was unmistakable. Mitchell had been keeping a personal record of every job he had completed for Volkov's organization, creating an inadvertent confession that had survived nearly 5 decades underwater. The Lighthouse entries included references to the cargo vessel Patricia Dawn, which had mysteriously caught fire in 1972 while carrying a shipment of electronics worth $2.8 million. The freighter Lake Guardian appeared next, having suffered a catastrophic hull breach in 1973 that sent $3.2 million in machinery to the bottom of Lake Huron. Each incident had been thoroughly investigated at the time, and each had been ruled accidental. Crawford's team began systematically reviewing these historical cases, looking for the same patterns they had identified in the Northern Star investigation. The similarities were striking. In each instance, the vessels had been carrying unusually valuable cargo for their size and typical routes. Insurance payouts had been processed quickly and without significant dispute, and in several cases the shipping companies involved had connections to businesses within Volkov's network. The Patricia Dawn fire had been attributed to faulty electrical systems, much like the Northern Star explosion. Survivors reported seeing unfamiliar crew members in the hours before the incident, but these accounts had been dismissed as confusion caused by smoke inhalation. The ship's manifest showed discrepancies similar to those found on the Northern Star, with certain cargo items listed vaguely or not at all. Most tellingly, the salvage rights to the Patricia Dawn had been quietly purchased by a company called Great Lakes Recovery Services just weeks after the incident. Public records showed that this company was a subsidiary of Northern Maritime Holdings, which in turn was controlled by a trust fund managed by the same law firm that still represented Volkov's interests decades later. The Lake Guardian case presented an even clearer picture of the conspiracy in action. The freighter had been carrying a mixed cargo load, but the most valuable items were specialized mining equipment bound for operations in northern Ontario. When the ship began taking on water, the crew reported that the pumping systems failed to operate properly, despite having been inspected and certified just days earlier. Investigation records from 1973 showed that the Lake Guardian's pumps had been sabotaged, though investigators at the time had concluded that the damage occurred during the sinking rather than before. Mitchell's notes, however, included technical drawings showing exactly how the pump systems could be disabled in a way that would appear accidental. The precision of his annotations left no doubt that the Lake Guardian's fate had been sealed before it ever left port. Elena Vasquez's financial records provided the final pieces of the puzzle. Her meticulous bookkeeping showed regular payments to something called Marine Consulting Services throughout the early 1970s. The amounts corresponded perfectly with the insurance payouts from each of the suspicious maritime incidents. Cross-referencing with bank records revealed that Marine Consulting Services was a front company used to funnel money to Mitchell and his demolitions team. The payments followed a consistent pattern. An initial deposit would be made weeks before each incident, followed by a larger sum transferred within days of the insurance settlement. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Someone with access to insurance processing information was coordinating these payments, ensuring that Mitchell and his team were compensated as soon as the fraud proceeds became available. Crawford's investigation expanded to include insurance industry records from the 1970s. What they discovered was a network of corruption that extended far beyond Volkov's shipping operations. Claims adjusters had been bribed to expedite settlements. Marine surveyors had been paid to overlook evidence of sabotage. Even some Coast Guard officials had received payments in exchange for limiting the scope of their investigations. The scale of the conspiracy was breathtaking. Over the course of 5 years, Volkov's organization had orchestrated at least 12 maritime incidents across the Great Lakes, resulting in fraudulent insurance claims totaling more than $30 million. The human cost was equally staggering. 47 people had died in these manufactured disasters, their lives sacrificed for financial gain by men who viewed them as acceptable losses. The Northern Star explosion had marked the end of this systematic criminal enterprise, but not by choice. Mitchell's death in the blast had eliminated Volkov's most skilled operative, while the unexpected violence of the explosion had attracted too much investigative attention. The organization had disbanded quietly, its members disappearing into legitimate businesses or simply vanishing from public records entirely. By late 2023, the Joint Task Force had assembled enough evidence to proceed with formal charges, despite the decades that had passed since the crimes were committed. The legal framework was complex, involving multiple jurisdictions and statutes of limitations that varied between countries. However, the severity of the offenses and the clear documentary evidence provided grounds for prosecution under international maritime law. The challenge lay in finding defendants who were still alive and mentally competent to stand trial. Volkov's condition made prosecution questionable, though his financial assets could still be seized under civil forfeiture proceedings. Most of Mitchell's known associates had died in the intervening years, victims of age, accident, or in some cases, what appeared to be deliberately orchestrated silencing. One significant exception was Marcus Webb, the diver who had originally discovered the waterproof locker. As the investigation progressed, background checks revealed that Webb's father had worked as a marine engineer in the 1970s, specializing in hull modifications and cargo handling systems. Financial records showed that the elder Webb had received several large cash payments during the same period that Mitchell was conducting his sabotage operations. The connection raised uncomfortable questions about whether the locker's discovery had been entirely accidental. Webb had been specifically exploring the debris field where the container was found, despite the fact that other areas of the wreck would have been more interesting from an archaeological perspective. His diving log showed that he had made several previous visits to the Northern Star site, always alone and always in the same general area where the evidence was eventually recovered. When confronted with this information, Webb initially denied any knowledge of his father's involvement with Volkov's organization. However, faced with documentary evidence linking his father to multiple suspicious payments, he eventually admitted that he had grown up hearing stories about insurance jobs and easy money from maritime accidents. His father had never explicitly described his role in the conspiracy, but had dropped enough hints over the years for Webb to piece together the general outline of the operation. The decision to explore the Northern Star wreck, Webb finally admitted, had not been random. His father had told him, shortly before his death in 2019, that there might be something worth finding in the debris field. The old man had been vague about details, but had mentioned that Mitchell had been paranoid about keeping records and might have hidden documentation somewhere on the ship. Webb's confession added another layer of complexity to the case. While his discovery of the evidence had been crucial to exposing the conspiracy, his motivation had been personal rather than academic. He had been searching for proof of his father's involvement, hoping to either clear his name or understand the extent of his crimes. The fact that he had found exactly what he was looking for raised questions about what other evidence might still be hidden in the depths of the Great Lakes. Dr. Chen's archaeological team expanded their survey to include the other vessels mentioned in Mitchell's records. Using advanced sonar imaging and remotely operated vehicles, they began systematically exploring the wrecks of the Patricia Dawn, Lake Guardian, and several other ships that had met suspicious ends in the 1970s. The underwater environment had preserved these sites remarkably well, creating a time capsule of criminal evidence that had been waiting decades for discovery. The Patricia Dawn yielded particularly damning findings. Embedded in what remained of the ship's electrical system were fragments of an incendiary device that bore Mitchell's distinctive technical markings. The Lake Guardian's hull showed clear evidence of deliberate weakening, with stress points that had been carefully calculated to ensure catastrophic failure under specific conditions. Each wreck told the same story of premeditated destruction, disguised as mechanical failure. As word of the investigation spread through maritime communities across the Great Lakes, other families began coming forward with suspicions about losses they had suffered decades earlier. Coast Guard veterans recalled incidents that had never quite made sense. Insurance investigators admitted to being pressured to close cases quickly, without thoroughly examining all the evidence. A pattern of institutional corruption and willful blindness began to emerge, showing how Volkov's organization had operated with virtual impunity for years. The public revelation of the conspiracy sent shockwaves through the shipping industry and prompted calls for comprehensive reforms in maritime safety oversight. Insurance companies faced lawsuits from families of victims who'd been told their loved ones died in accidents, only to learn that they had actually been murdered for financial gain. The legal ramifications would continue for years, but the historical record had finally been corrected. The Northern Star locker had done more than expose a single criminal conspiracy. It had revealed the vulnerability of entire regulatory systems and the ease with which determined criminals could exploit jurisdictional gaps and institutional complacency. The 23 people who died in that explosion had not perished in a tragic accident, but had been victims of a calculated murder scheme that treated human life as a commodity to be traded for profit margins. For Henrik Volkov, the truth had remained buried as long as he drew breath. The 87-year-old man who claimed confusion and memory loss when questioned about his maritime empire would never face trial. His condition deteriorated rapidly following the investigation's public revelation, and he died peacefully in his care facility in January 2024, taking with him any hope of a full confession or complete accounting of his crimes. His death, however, did not end the pursuit of justice. Civil asset forfeiture proceedings moved forward against his estate, which investigators discovered was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Hidden behind layers of shell companies and offshore trusts were properties, investments, and cash reserves totaling nearly $40 million. Much of this wealth could be directly traced to the insurance payouts from the maritime disasters of the 1970s. Money that had been carefully laundered and invested over decades of careful financial management. The families of the Northern Star victims received the first settlements from the seized assets in the spring of 2024. For many, the monetary compensation could never restore what had been lost, but it provided a measure of closure that had been denied them for nearly 50 years. Margaret Hayes, the widow of Captain Robert Hayes, had spent decades believing her husband died because of mechanical failure and poor maintenance decisions. Learning that he had actually been murdered as part of an elaborate fraud scheme was devastating, but it also answered questions that had haunted her for half a century. The investigation's conclusion brought unexpected consequences for the maritime insurance industry. Companies that had paid out millions in claims during the 1970s launched their own internal reviews, searching for other cases that might have involved similar fraud. The patterns identified by Crawford's team became the template for a new generation of forensic accountants and maritime investigators, trained to recognize the subtle signs of orchestrated disasters. Marcus Webb faced his own reckoning. While his discovery of the locker had been crucial to exposing the conspiracy, his failure to disclose his family connection to the case raised ethical questions about his motives and methods. Dr. Chen's archaeological project was completed without his participation, and he quietly left the technical diving community shortly after the investigation concluded. His father's role in the deaths of 47 innocent people would be a burden he would carry for the rest of his life. The Northern Star itself remained on the lake bottom, its broken hull now serving as both a memorial to those who died and a reminder of how easily institutional failures could enable criminal enterprise. The site was designated as a protected historical location, with diving access restricted to prevent further disturbance of what had become, in essence, a crime scene frozen in time. Thomas Mitchell's waterproof locker had survived 48 years beneath the waters of Lake Superior, waiting for the right combination of technology, curiosity, and chance to bring its secrets to light. The documents and photographs preserved within those sealed walls had not only solved one of the Great Lakes' most tragic mysteries, but had exposed a criminal conspiracy that spanned years and claimed dozens of lives. The case demonstrated how the passage of time could work both for and against the pursuit of justice. While many of the perpetrators had escaped accountability through death or disability, the same decades that protected them had also preserved evidence that might otherwise have been destroyed. Cold lake water and an airtight container had created the perfect conditions for truth to survive, even when those who created that truth had long since vanished. In the end, the Northern Star investigation served as a stark reminder that some secrets refuse to stay buried forever. The 23 souls lost in that July morning explosion had finally received the justice they deserved, and their families had learned the truth about why they died. It was a resolution purchased with patience, technology, and the simple fact that sometimes the most damning evidence lies waiting in the most unexpected places. The waterproof locker that changed everything now sits in a climate-controlled evidence room, its contents digitized and preserved for future researchers. It stands as testament to the power of meticulous record-keeping, even by those engaged in the darkest enterprises. Thomas Mitchell's paranoid attention to detail had ultimately destroyed the very conspiracy he helped create, ensuring that justice, however delayed, would eventually prevail.